The baby wasn't crying when Trieu Duong found it. That was the first thing that made his heart drop. It was early morning, the kind of cold that clung to the mist rolling down from the mountains. The narrow dirt road leading back to his village was still wet from the night rain, and every step Duong took left a faint imprint behind him. After 2 years in the military, this was supposed to be the moment he had imagined countless times. Walking back home, breathing in the scent of wet earth, hearing the distant echo of roosters and the rustling bamboo. But instead, he heard something else. A faint, almost broken sound, not quite a cry, more like a breath struggling to exist. He stopped. His instincts, trained, sharpened by 2 years of discipline, told him something was wrong. He turned his head slowly, scanning the roadside bushes. The sound came again, barely audible, and then he saw it. A small bundle, wrapped in a thin, damp cloth, lying just beside a cluster of wild grass. For a second, his mind refused to understand what his eyes were seeing. Then his body moved before his thoughts could catch up. "Hey, hello?" His voice trembled slightly as he rushed forward, kneeling down. He reached out, his hands that had held rifles, dug trenches, endured harsh training, now suddenly unsure, almost afraid to touch what lay before him. He carefully lifted the cloth, and everything inside him shattered. A newborn baby, tiny, fragile, skin pale from the cold, lips slightly trembling, eyes barely open. "No, no, no," he whispered, his throat tightening. The baby's chest rose weakly, still alive, but barely. Duong's heartbeat pounded violently in his ears. He looked around instinctively. Empty road, silent forest, no one in sight. Who could do this? Who could leave a child like this, to die? He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. Panic would not save the baby. Hey, it's okay. I'm here," he murmured softly, his voice completely different now. Gentle, careful, almost as if he was afraid to disturb the fragile life in his arms. He quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around the baby, pulling the tiny body close to his chest, using his own warmth to fight the cold. The baby let out a faint sound, not a full cry, but enough to make Duong feel something deep inside his chest crack open. "If you're watching this story right now, what would you do in my place?" he muttered under his breath, as if speaking to someone beyond the moment. "Would you leave, or would you stay?" He didn't wait for an answer. He stood up and started running. The path back to his house had never felt so long. His boots slipped slightly on the muddy ground, but he didn't slow down. Every second mattered. He could feel the baby's weak breathing against his chest, and each breath felt like it could be the last. "Hold on, please just hold on," he whispered over and over again. His house finally appeared through the trees. A small stone house, simple, old, but standing strong against time. The red-tiled roof glistened slightly under the morning light. He kicked the wooden door open. "I'm back!" he shouted instinctively, then paused. There was no one inside to answer. The silence reminded him of everything he had lost, but there was no time to dwell. He rushed inside, quickly clearing a space on the wooden bed. His movements were fast but careful, every action guided by urgency and instinct. "What do babies need? Milk, warmth," he muttered, thinking aloud. He grabbed an old kettle, poured water, and lit a fire with trembling hands. Years of military training had taught him how to survive in harsh conditions, but nothing had prepared him for this, taking care of a newborn life. He searched through the small cabinet and found a can of condensed milk, one of the few things left in the house. "It's not perfect, but it's something," he whispered. He mixed it quickly with warm water, testing the temperature on his wrist, just like he had once seen someone do. Then came the hardest part, feeding the baby. He sat down slowly, holding the baby in his arms, supporting the tiny head with surprising care. "Come on, you need to drink. You have to live." His voice cracked. At first, the baby didn't respond. Duong's heart tightened. "Please, don't give up." Then, finally, a small movement, weak but real. The baby's lips touched the makeshift bottle, and slowly, painfully slowly, it began to drink. Duong let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Tears blurred his vision. "You're stronger than you look," he whispered, a faint smile appearing for the first time. Hours passed. The baby slept, wrapped in layers of cloth and Duong's jacket. He sat beside it, not daring to move too far, his eyes constantly watching the tiny rise and fall of its chest. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. But none of that mattered. For the first time since returning home, he didn't feel empty. He felt needed. As the sunlight slowly filled the room, Duong leaned back slightly, exhaustion finally catching up to him, but his mind refused to rest. "What now?" he whispered. He couldn't keep the baby without proper care. It needed vaccines, medical checkups, a real chance to live. He clenched his fists. "I'll take you to the clinic," he said firmly, looking at the sleeping baby. "No matter what." Then he paused, his voice softer now. "But if I take you there, will they take you away from me?" Silence answered him. A deep, heavy silence. He looked at the baby again, so small, so alone, just like he once was. "If you've ever felt alone, abandoned, I want you to leave a comment below," he said quietly, almost as if sharing a secret. "Because maybe, just maybe, someone out there understands you." He gently adjusted the blanket around the baby. "I won't leave you," he whispered. "I promise." Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees around the small stone house. Inside, a new life had begun. But neither of them knew. This decision, this moment, would change everything. And not everyone would accept it. The baby started crying just before dawn. Not the weak, broken sound from before, but a real cry. Loud, sharp, alive. Trieu Duong opened his eyes instantly. For a split second, he didn't know where he was. The past 2 years in the military had trained his body to react before his mind could catch up. But then the cry came again, piercing through the quiet of the small stone house, and everything rushed back. The road, the bundle, the fragile life he had chosen not to walk away from. I'm here, he whispered, already moving. He rushed to the bed and carefully picked up the baby, his hands still slightly clumsy but far more confident than yesterday. The baby's tiny face was red, eyes squeezed shut, fists clenched tightly as it cried with all the strength it had. Duong felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. "You're stronger today," he said softly, almost proud. But then reality hit him again. Strength wasn't enough. This child needed more than just warmth and a few drops of milk. It needed protection, a future, and that was something Duong wasn't sure he could give. Later that morning, the village began to wake. Smoke rose from rooftops, chickens wandered freely, and distant voices slowly filled the quiet air. Life was moving on, as if nothing had changed. But inside that small stone house, everything had. Duong wrapped the baby carefully, securing it against his chest with a piece of cloth. He stepped outside, squinting slightly as the sunlight hit his face. 2 years. 2 years away, and yet everything felt both familiar and strange. As he walked down the narrow path toward the village clinic, people began to notice. At first, just glances, then whispers. "Isn't that Duong? He just came back, right? But what is he holding? A baby? Whose child is that? The whispers grew louder. Each word felt like a weight pressing against his back. But he didn't stop. He kept walking. The clinic was small, modest, with peeling paint and a faded sign. But to Duong, it felt like the most important place in the world at that moment. He pushed the door open. A middle-aged nurse looked up from her desk. "Yes?" she asked. Then her eyes dropped to the bundle in his arms. Her expression changed instantly. "Is that a newborn?" Duong nodded. "I found the baby on the road yesterday morning," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "It was left there, alone." The nurse stood up quickly, her face serious now. "Bring the baby here." Duong stepped forward, gently placing the baby on the examination table. His hands lingered for a second longer than necessary, as if he was afraid to let go. The nurse began checking the baby, heartbeat, temperature, breathing. Duong watched every movement, his heart tightening with each second. "Well?" he asked, unable to hold back. The nurse looked at him. "The baby is weak, but stable," she said. "You brought it in time." Duong closed his eyes briefly. Relief, but only for a moment. "There's more," the nurse continued. "The baby needs vaccinations, regular checkups, proper nutrition. This is not something you can handle alone." Duong's jaw tightened. "I'll do whatever it takes." The nurse hesitated. "Are you the father?" The question hung in the air. Duong looked down at the baby. A memory flashed in his mind. Himself at 12 years old, standing alone at his parents' funeral, surrounded by people but feeling completely abandoned. "No," he said quietly, "but I won't leave this child." By noon, the entire village knew, and by evening, they started coming. At first, just a few neighbors, then more. Curiosity turned into judgment. "You just came back from the military and now you bring home a baby? Where did it come from? Are you hiding something? Do you even have money to raise a child?" Each question was sharper than the last. Duong stood in front of his house, the baby sleeping quietly inside. "I found the child," he said firmly. "That's all." But the murmurs didn't stop. An older man stepped forward. "Young man," he said, his voice calm but cold. "Good intentions are not enough. Raising a child is not a game." "I know." "Then think carefully. If you can't give it a proper life, maybe it's better to let the authorities handle it." Those words hit harder than anything else. Let it go. Give it away. Duong clenched his fists. His mind started to spiral. They weren't wrong. He had no stable income, no family, no experience, just a maybe. Then the so leave your checked and all the sky, the road, her hand, then memory. His thoughts echoed in his mind. If I give the baby back, will he be safe? If I don't, am I taking away his only family? His chest tightened. This was harder than anything he had faced in the military, because this wasn't about strength, it was about letting go. "If you were in his place, what would you choose?" he said quietly, as if speaking to someone far beyond the moment. "Keep the child you saved, or return him to the one who gave him life. Comment your answer below, because sometimes there is no right choice." He looked at the woman again, at her trembling hands, at her broken eyes, and suddenly, he saw himself, years ago, alone, lost, wanting someone, anyone, to give him another chance. Duong slowly stepped forward. The woman held her breath. "I won't forgive what you did," he said honestly. She lowered her head, tears falling faster. "But," his voice softened, "I understand why you did it." Her eyes widened. He carefully adjusted the baby in his arms, looking down one last time. The tiny face, the small fingers that had once held on to his. "You deserve to know your mother," he whispered. His voice cracked. "And she deserves a chance to become one." With slow, heavy movements, he extended his arms. The woman froze, as if she didn't dare believe it. "Take him," Duong said. Her hands shook violently as she reached out, receiving the baby like it was the most precious thing in the world. The moment the baby touched her chest, she broke down completely. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she whispered over and over again. Duong turned away slightly, because if he looked any longer, he might not be able to let go. Days passed. The house felt quieter, colder, empty again. But something had changed inside Duong. He didn't feel lost anymore. He felt purposeful. Each morning he worked harder, clearing land, planting seeds, building fences, slowly, piece by piece. A small green farm began to take shape, not just for himself, but for the future he had chosen to build. One afternoon, a familiar voice called out, "Duong!" He turned. The woman stood there again, but this time, she wasn't alone. The baby was in her arms, healthy, stronger, alive. I found work in the next village," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm trying to start over." Duong nodded. "That's good." She hesitated, then stepped closer. If it's okay," she said softly, "can we visit sometimes?" Duong looked at the baby. The baby looked back, and for a brief second, a tiny smile appeared. Duong's heart softened. "This place is always open," he said. As the sun slowly set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the small stone house and the growing green farm, 3 lives stood quietly together. Not perfect, not without pain, but moving forward, together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Duong's voice echoed softly, like a message carried by the wind. Because sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can change an entire life. And somewhere in that quiet mountain village, a boy who once had nothing had finally found something worth building for. Not just a home, but a future.